Hi, everyone. So thrilled you could join us today for another installation of the IWF Book Club. I'm really excited today. We're going to be discussing this month's book by Jason Riley, which is Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. I learned a ton from this book, and I had thought I had read sort of the basics of the man, but learned a lot about him and his intellectual history through this book. But Jason Riley is a Manhattan Institute fellow. He's a Wall Street Journal columnist. You probably read his columns. He's also a Fox News commentator. So you've probably heard of him and his work before, but here he does this incredible intellectual deep dive into another scholar's work. So before we invite Jason on stage, I'm just going to toss it over to Carrie briefly to just explain how this whole virtual platform that we're using works.
Thank you, Inez. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to engage and have this be a conversation. And we hope that you're going to ask a question and join our chat room and take our polls. So you'll see that we have a chat room on the right side of your screen where you can join the discussion with the other attendees and my IWF colleagues who will have the word team next to their names. If you don't see the chat room, click chat on the bottom right corner of the screen. Now, next to the chat room tab, there's also a questions tab. If you have a question for Jason, please post it in the questions tab. Make sure that you're doing questions, not the chat generally. You can give other attendees questions a bump. If you like it, bump it up by hitting the up arrows, and that will help us to find these questions faster. We want to definitely get to the best ones because we know Jason's time is limited. There's also a polls tab as well, where one of my colleagues has posted some of the questions for you to answer. We encourage all of you to take these polls, mix things up a little bit. Also, you can click the react button at the bottom of the screen. It's going to send emoji reactions at any time during the event. Now, toward the end of our time today, we will be drawing and announcing the names of 3 lucky winners who are going to get signed copies of this book. But in order to win, you must be present during the drawing here at the end of today's event. So that's an incentive for you to stick around. These books are going to be sent out in the mail to our door prize winners. All right, we should be all set, Inez.
Thanks, Carrie. So with all that technical stuff out of the way, we are thrilled to bring up Jason Riley, who again is the author of Maverick, that book we're discussing this book club. Just see if he can get up here on the stage. Hey, Jason, thank you so much again for joining us and for writing this book.
Thank you for having me.
I guess I'll start with the really basic question that I'm sure you get a lot. What made you decide to want to take this real deep dive into Thomas Sowell's sort of intellectual history? You write, of course, about his life to some extent in the sense that to understand the man, you have to understand his life. But this is really like an intellectual sort of journey through all of Sowell's work. So what inspired you to write this biography?
Well, it was a couple different things inspired me to write it. The reason I wanted to focus on his ideas, on his legacy as an intellectual, is because he did not have a biographer who had done that. And I thought he was someone worthy of biographical treatment. I was quite surprised, in fact, that he hadn't had a biographer, but he didn't. He didn't actually particularly want one. Took some talking him into cooperating for the book and sitting for some long interviews. And he had already published a memoir. So if you wanted a deep dive, so to speak, into his personal life, he had published that. But he wanted to focus on his ideas and what his legacy would be as a scholar. And so that's one of the reasons I not only wanted to write the book, but to take it in that direction. The other reason I wanted to write the book was out of a sort of frustration that many people had heard names like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram Kendi and Cornel West and that sort of group, Nicole Hannah-Jones, but had not heard of Thomas Sowell. And I thought that Tom was someone who had written circles around those individuals, maybe around all of them put together, in fact. And I thought it was quite a shame that they were so much better known than Soule. And it wasn't just the range of Tom's writings, covering not only their issues like race, ethnicity, and so forth, but Tom has written on political philosophy. He's a social theorist. He's an historian. He's a sociologist. I just thought that more people should know who he is. And he's not only written about these things for a long time. He's addressed many of the arguments we hear today on a lot of these issues, whether we're talking about social justice or affirmative action or the minimum wage laws, school choice. Tom has weighed in on this stuff for decades, and I wanted to highlight some of that work.
Yeah, Jason, it was an incredible read. I really loved it, and I'm so glad that you wrote it. And just reaffirming the fact that Thomas Sowell is so grounded in economics, facts, and data, unlike those names that you just mentioned, who are more about emotions and bluster. But I know that Soule, he also writes a lot about culture and economics. And I used to work for an AEI scholar, and we would get into these debates about chicken versus egg. He would say that the economic policy drives culture, and I would always say vice versa. What do you think Thomas Sowell would say about this chicken or egg? Do you think that it matters for him which comes first? And do you think that he would say that it's culture first, since he refused to work in government?
Well, Tom did have some government jobs. In fact, one of his
jobs, like major, high profile.
Well, he did decline invites to join administrations in official roles. He was picked. He was nominated, or his name was floated for various positions in government: Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Commerce, during the Ford administration and the Reagan administration, and he regularly refused to do that. At the suggestion of his mentor, Milton Friedman, who also resisted entreaties to officially join administrations, thinking he could play a more constructive role outside of government. But I think Soule has written quite a bit about the primacy of culture in terms of addressing inequality and a pathway for groups to rise from poverty to prosperity. And I think he would point to many examples around the world of that happening, whether you're talking about the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, whether you're talking about Japanese in America or in other countries. There are just examples after examples of minority groups, oftentimes hated minority groups, rising economically because they had what Soule and other economists call the human capital. They had the skills and the habits and the behaviors and the attitudes that are conducive to upward mobility. And if you have that, Soule says that can help a group overcome all kinds of resistance from the larger society and move up socioeconomically. So he has long stressed the primacy of culture in terms of upward mobility.
One of the things that was interesting to me, again, as sort of reading, I think maybe the later part of Soule's career, and not knowing as much about his early career or some of the early debates that he weighed in on, it was interesting to me to see that some of our debates about whether the primacy of culture or sort of law or public policy are responsible for inequities or inequalities. It was surprising to me to see that a lot of those debates were happening during the civil rights era as well. Your book really shows there was more of a continuation. I think a lot of us think of it as these two totally separate debates, one about legal de jure equality, and then one about all the sort of social debates that we have now about inequalities and how to rectify them. One of the things I learned is that some of these sort of debates that we're having now, Soule really thought were predictable from the civil rights era.
Sure.
Can you maybe go in a little bit and talk about how he was able to foresee that we would all be yelling at each other about some of this stuff? And he didn't immediately think that, for example, even though he favored the Civil Rights Act, that it would solve these questions or end these debates.
Yes, that's right. Soule was an early supporter of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and early 1960s. He supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I mean, even going back further, you forget how old Soule is. But he was born in 1930, And he remembers quite well. In fact, he was at night school at Howard University in Washington, D.C., when the Brown versus Board of Education decision came down in 1954, which he again supported that decision. He thought the court made the right call there, but he didn't see it as some elixir that was some silver bullet that was going to solve all the problems that blacks faced. And similarly with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 or 4 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, again, Soule supported these things, but he didn't think that they were going to be silver bullets in terms of helping blacks advance. Where he started to break with the civil rights movement was in the late 60s and the early 70s, in the post-King era. And that is because the civil rights leadership shifted away from seeking seeking equal opportunity to seeking special preferences. And so the battles over the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were about giving blacks access to jobs, to the labor force, to accommodations and so forth, to schools, and Soule was all for that. But when the civil rights movement shifted to seeking special treatment, affirmative action, racial preferences, that is when he parted ways for them, not only on moral grounds, but he didn't think that it would work. Shoehorning blacks into jobs that they were ill-equipped for was going to backfire, or into schools where they could not handle the work was going to backfire and cause a backlash in society. And so he parted ways, became quite critical of the civil rights movement in this era. The other thing the civil rights movement did back then is they shifted away from that focus on the development of human capital that I mentioned earlier, that had been a mainstay of civil rights leadership through the 30s and 40s and 50s and so forth. They shifted away from that and towards seeking more political power as a way of advancing blacks, getting more blacks elected to office. That became a focus of the civil rights movement in the post-King era. And Soule, too, thought that that was a mistake, taking your eye off the ball in terms of that human development and thinking political power was going to advance the economic interests of blacks. And that true, too, has been borne out, that it hasn't happened. I mean, I think the number of black elected officials has grown from fewer than 1,500 in 1970 to more than 10,000 today, including, of course, a twice elected black president. But the economic advancement that we were told by proponents of that strategy would occur has not occurred. Even as blacks have, run these large cities, your Detroits, your Washington D.C.s, your Los Angeleses, your New Yorks. If you look at what was going on in Marion Barry's Washington D.C. in the 1980s, or in Sharp James's Newark, New Jersey in the 1990s, or in Coleman Young's Detroit in the 1960s and stuff. I mean, the black poor got poorer on their watch. And that is not to say that blacks should stay out of politics or not run for office and so forth. No, the point is that political power alone is not going to close these racial gaps, which is what the civil rights leadership was telling us was going to happen when they made that shift towards seeking more political power in the 1960s and early 70s. And Soule predicted that.
I want to let our viewers know, just giving a shout out to another book that you wrote, Jason Riley, on this theme, which is called False Black Power. So if anybody's really interested in taking a deeper dive into what Jason's talking about how political power has not translated into better outcomes for Black America, that's another book that I just want everyone to know. I will plug it for you, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you.
But I want to ask you, so Soule has said that racism is not the primary driver of what's holding back Black Americans, or as some would say, systemic racism. But Soule also does not deny the existence of racism. So 2 questions for you. Would you say that in Soule's view, what does he think about CRT, and what should we know about CRT? And then number 2, where would racism fall in the order of a list if we were to rank a list of variables about what's causing poverty and other social ills in Black America? Where would racism fall in that list?
Well, let me answer the second question first. And Soule spent quite a bit of his career writing about this. it's very hard to tell what effect racism per se is having on the advancement or lack of advancement of this group or that group. And one reason why is because racism has been the constant. Racism has been around down through human history. Yet some groups have advanced notwithstanding it and others have not. Or there have been periods of advancement and then periods of retrogression. So for instance, to take the case of Black Americans in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, you saw dramatic reductions in the Black poverty rate. You saw Black families that were far more intact than they are today. Marriage rates for Black Americans were higher than for whites through the 1920s and 30s and 40s and well into the 50s, at a time when, as was mentioned earlier, there was legal discrimination. There was Jim Crow. Black violent crime rates were much lower in the 1940s and 50s. And Blacks were earning or were increasing their years of education, both in absolute terms and relative to whites. Their earnings were climbing at much faster rates than whites, all through the first half of the 20th century, when you had, again, legal segregation in place, when you could refuse housing to Blacks, when you could put a sign in your window that said, "We don't hire Black workers here." Blacks were making these tremendous gains. Yet in the post-60s era, and for much of the second half of the 20th century, we saw a lot of decline in the rate of progress, stalling of progress, or sometimes retrogression. So again, but racism has been the constant throughout both of these eras. So it's hard to pin that on racism per se. But that is often, of course, what is done today. In terms of critical race theory, I think that Soule would take issue to the extent that, or has taken issue, he's written about this, to the extent that it uses racism as an all-purpose explanation for the problems the Black face today. Soule has resisted that explanation, and for the reasons I just laid out, that you've seen progress. And this is not just about Black progress. I mean, you take a group like Japanese Americans. They come to this country, they're denied work in certain professions, can't own land in certain states, go through periods of lynching, can't attend certain schools. Yet for decades, Japanese Americans have out-earned white Americans in this country, despite that history, despite being interned in camps during World War II and so forth. They out-earn white Americans. And then you can go to the other end and look at the fact that Blacks out-earn Hispanics, though no one would claim that Hispanics have faced more discrimination in America than Blacks. But if the thinking of the critical race theorists is applied here, what would explain the fact that Blacks are out-earning Hispanics and that Japanese are out-earning whites? So this all-purpose explanation, blanket explanation of racism as a reason for our racial differences in income, educational attainment, and so forth, I think is something that Soule has taken issue with for decades throughout his career.
The analysis you just gave us, right, is heavily dependent on facts, which was a theme of Soule's work and his quotes that Michelle is throwing up in the chat, and of your biography of him, that he was always reluctant to accept quote unquote conventional wisdom, or even things that seemed, I'm not even just talking about political conventional wisdom, but just assumptions. He was always looking for assumptions underlying conventional wisdom that could then be tested against the facts and then sometimes found wanting. We live in a world now, something that Soule also predicted all the way from the 60s and saw coming, where academia, in many fields, the chief progenitor of these kinds of facts, right? The people who are going to be doing the research that then, can actually quantify whether some of these premises are true or false. Mm-hmm. That institution is so captured by ideology, but even their underlying factual work is often suspect or not up to any kind of scholarly standard.
Right.
what difficulties do you think that presents for, for you or future souls, like people who really want to test all of these, empirically test these assumptions against data sets, against facts? How are we going to be able to introduce facts into the discussion as you have just done, when the academy is so captured as to not want to actually do the research to find those facts?
You're right. It is a challenge. If facts don't matter to people, it's going to be hard to persuade them to do the right thing, particularly on some of these very emotional topics like race and ethnicity that seem to be in the forefront of our public debates these days. But Soule is an empiricist. This is something that was stressed at the University of Chicago, where he did his graduate work in economics under Milton Friedman and George Stigler, to all other economists known for their rigorous empirical approach. And one thing that was stressed at the University of Chicago is, at places like MIT or Harvard, economics was about math and eloquent theories and elaborate equations and so forth. At Chicago, under Friedman in particular, it was about how economics can be applied to everyday life, to problem solving, facts and evidence and logic, and that is something you see in Soule's work throughout his career. And I think what you also see in Tom's work is an interest in spreading economic literacy, much as Milton Friedman did after he left teaching and wrote popular books and went to college campuses and spoke to students and other groups about economics. They really felt it was important to be able to explain their discipline to non-experts. And that's why a vast majority of Tom's works are not written for his peers in the academy. They're written for the general public. They're written for people who know nothing about economics or very little about economics. And he thinks that through the spread of economic literacy, you will get at people who do care about facts and be able to explain to them the importance of facts. But you're right. In many of our debates today, particularly over race, whether you're talking about crime or policing or affirmative action, these seem like fact-free zones, fact-free conversations taking place where you bring up data and people look at you like you have two heads. I mean, I constantly hear, for example, just to elaborate on something we were talking about earlier, about how these crime rates in these Black communities are so high because poverty rates are so high in these communities. So of course crime is going to be high. Poor people are going to commit crimes. Well, that doesn't explain, as Soule would say, why you had much lower crime rates back in the 1940s and 50s in Black communities, when Black people were, of course, a lot poorer than they are today. And that's just an example of empiricism at work. If you're going to make the argument that poverty causes crime, you have to explain why there were lower crime rates when there were higher poverty rates. And that is something that gets you canceled if you were to make such a claim today.
So Jason, I before I ask this question, I want to give a plug because I know it's a topic at least under your roof of your house there, because your wife, Naomi Schaefer Riley, is a fellow with us, and she wrote a book here called Got Religion, How Churches, Mosques, and Synagogues Can Bring Young People Back. So I just want to give a shout out to her because the topic is related to my question for you about Thomas Sowell, which is that at least in your review here in your book on Soule, you do mention Soule's analysis of culture and this idea of the human capital development. But in this review, Soule is pretty silent specifically on religion and faith and its impact on culture and economics. So what's his view on faith, and how much does that or does not impact his view on educational and economic outcomes within Black America?
Well, I didn't come across in my research much writing on his behalf on the topic specifically. And I don't get the impression he's a particularly religious person himself. I think he was raised by a great aunt. He was orphaned as a child, and his father died before he was born, and his mother died giving birth to an older brother. or younger brother, I'm sorry. And so this great aunt took him in, and she had 2 adult children of her own, one of whom was married. And I do believe she was a religious person. So in his youth, I think Soule did attend church on a somewhat regular basis. You can also hear this in some of his phrasing of, he talks about the anointed and class of intellectuals, and you sort of get religious references, a sense that he is familiar with the language of the church, but I don't get the sense that he is particularly religious. One thing I did come across, though, is that in his books on social theory, and particularly the book Knowledge and Decisions, which is about decision making and the importance of the dissemination of decision making in a free market economy, he talks about these sort of units in society that help people make decisions and help people make the right decisions. Family is one of them. And religious groups are another one that he stresses as playing an important role in helping people make the right decisions in their lives. So there's certainly a respect for religious institutions, even if I didn't get the sense that he was a particularly religious person.
So he would say there is a correlation. I know the work of Charles Murray and other scholars have shown a correlation between, the community at least offered by faith as positive.
And in the sense of a respect for tradition. The church has played a role in helping groups develop. And you could use the Irish as a good example of this in Tom's writings on migration. A lot of the traits that you see in poor Black communities today, you saw among the Irish in the 19th century. And it was the Catholic Church who helped them develop that human capital. Everything from things like hygiene to starting schools, starting hospitals, and so forth. Assimilating Irish immigrants. The church played a huge role in doing that. Similarly, the Black church is still one of the more viable institutions in the Black community today. And I think in Soule's work, you see a respect for such institutions and the role they have played traditionally. I mean, you mentioned my wife. Her current book is about the foster care system. It's called No Way to Treat a Child, and the problems there within that system. And she points out the role that the church plays in the foster care community today. So you still have the church playing these important roles, faith-based groups playing important roles, and whether it's helping to provide school choice or guidance, moral guidance, marriage counseling, and so forth in hard-hit communities. And I think Soule has a tremendous respect for that role that the church plays.
Mm-hmm. Plug. We actually had a conversation with Naomi about that book on foster care. So if any folks want to check that out also for IWF Reads, that was one of our monthly book chats with Carrie Lucas, our president.
Jason, for the most part in this book, you play your role as sort of neutral chronicler very, very well. But the one strain I sort of detected strongly throughout this book is sort of an indignation at and you referenced it a little bit when I asked you initially why you chose to take up this project, the indignation at the way that Tom Soule's work has been received, not just what you referenced about him perhaps not having the intellectual fame of somebody much less deserving like Ibram Kendi, but also in this book, just responding to unfair critiques of him, his work, his scholarship, and of him as a person that were just so obviously untrue given the depth and breadth of his scholarship. Do you want to maybe address some of those critiques here?
Well, it's really a frustration at the failure to engage his work and to dismiss him with ad hominem attacks instead of engaging his work. And I guess Soule sort of takes it as a compliment of sorts, meaning if they had arguments to come back at me with, they'd use them. And because they don't have any, they resort to name calling. And I think that's largely true. And you see that continue today on the Black left in particular. There are a lot of ad hominem attacks directed at people they disagree with. You could take someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones, whose Twitter feed is full of personal attacks on people who have made substantive criticisms of things she's written, and namely the 1619 Project. And this is something they've long resorted to. And there's also been an effort to dismiss Tom as a legitimate voice of Black thinking on various issues, and this goes back quite a long ways, mainly to when Tom began criticizing the civil rights movement, particularly in the 1970s when he turned his attention to doing that. There was an attempt effectively to use today's terms to cancel Tom, to say to members of the elite media and so forth, do not look to this man as a voice on Black issues of the day. And I think that is one of the reasons a lot of people know names like Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates and Cornel West and Michael Eric Dyson and so forth, but don't know Thomas Sowell. You know, the people who hand out the intellectual awards, the people who control academia, the people who largely control the mainstream media are liberal elites, and Tom has refused to play footsie with them, refused to pull his punches when it comes to critiquing their worldview, and it has cost him. It's cost him in terms of notoriety and fame and so forth. This is someone who has, continued to put truth above popularity, and I'm someone who certainly respects that. It's something that should not distinguish an intellectual or a scholar, but unfortunately it does. And just to elaborate on this for a little bit, I think the 1619 Project that I referenced earlier is a perfect example of this. There are no shortage of books on America's founding out there, on slavery, on the American Revolution. None of them have been written by Nicole Hannah-Jones. This work that she's put out there, which is now entering our K through 12 school system, is full of falsehoods, trying to put slavery at the center of America's founding, claiming that the economics of slavery are what made America a wealthy nation. These have been torn apart. But where are all the historians denouncing these? I mean, there have been a few out there, Sean Wilentz and James McPherson, Gordon Wood.
The Marxist WorldNet Daily.
A few of them. But why isn't every historian at every serious university in this country shouting from the rooftops that this woman doesn't know what she's talking about? It's because they're afraid. They're afraid of being canceled. They're afraid of her social media attacks. They're afraid of being called a sexist or a racist. Sowell was never afraid. And that is what distinguishes him, I think, as a scholar. He said he followed the facts where they led and reported the results, even if those results turned out to be politically incorrect. He spent a career doing that, and I think we need 100 more just like him.
Well, I am pleased to say that I was a victim of an attack, a series of attacks by Nicole Hannah-Jones, simply because I was helping Bob Woodson with the launch of his 1776 Unites project.
Okay.
Respond, and she later deleted her tweets, I think, because she didn't want them to remain. But I want to ask you about a passage, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience. In your book, again, Maverick, so you talk about a newspaper called the Chicago Defender that was put out to target the Black audience and support the Black audience in Chicago. And it gave advice, you write about things like, don't use vile language in public places, don't loaf, get a job at once, do not keep your children out of school. So just common sense, everyday advice. And then you say that in the 1960s, such talk began to be regarded as passé. And in later decades, it would be derided as respectability politics. But an earlier generation of Blacks that included Soule maintained that self-regard and self-respect were essential to economic progress and the results spoke for themselves. So, Soule, obviously he's prolific and he talks a lot about this, but this notion of respectability politics, do you think Soule, how could you get around this big problem? I went to inner city schools when I was in school, and one of only a few white kids, and I remember my friends who were friends with me were accused of acting white, that somehow there's something that respectability politics. What would you say Thomas Sowell would say is sort of the counter to this notion that in some ways wants to tell Black people, don't do these basic things?
Yeah, it gets back to culture again. I mean, that's what we're talking about with respectability politics, the cultural attitudes and habits and behaviors, and attitudes towards school, attitudes towards law enforcement. And I mean, and it was something that was stressed in Black America in the first half of the 20th century. That whole generation of civil rights leaders, your Thurgood Marshalls, your Martin Luther Kings, they were all about respectability politics. They thought it mattered how you carried yourself in society as they went about seeking equal rights for Blacks. I tell a story sometimes when I'm giving speeches about a column I wrote for the Wall Street Journal some years ago about violent crime in black neighborhoods, and I quoted something Martin Luther King had written or said to a Black congregation in St. Louis back in the early 1960s, and he said, we're something like 10% of the population of St. Louis, but responsible for 50-something% of the crimes. And he said, we've got to face that. We've got to do something about this moral problem that we have. We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves. We've got to face this. And I made direct quotes, and there are people who wrote into the paper and accused me of making up the quotes, which came from I believe a 1961 profile of King in Harper's Magazine by the famous Black author James Baldwin. And it was a little odd because, of course, these days all you have to do is Google a quote to find the source. But it dawned on me that the people making this accusation just couldn't believe, apparently, that this is how the nation's most prominent civil rights leadership used to talk about, Black responsibility, about personal responsibility and behavior in the Black community. But it was completely in line with the whole generation of how you address those issues. These folks asked something of Black people, even as they fought the white man, so to speak, for civil rights. They also asked something of Blacks. Today's civil rights leadership asks almost nothing of the Black community itself. Critical race theory posits that all Black problems are not only the fault of white people, but the responsibility of white people to solve. And that's something Soule has disagreed with quite forcefully throughout his career and his writings. But in that regard, there's a whole line of Black civil rights leaderships that believe the same thing. And in the post 60s era when that began to change.
Yeah, and that's something that comes through really clearly in your book, that as part of, I think, a defense, the charge, the really ugly charge, right, which is thrown at Thomas Sowell, I'm sure has been thrown at you in the past, has been thrown at folks who are Black, who are making arguments that are not in line, even if they're not conservative, right, that are just simply not in line with what the modern, quote unquote, civil rights movement might argue. It's that they are doing it on behalf of white people. And I think your book does a really good job of explaining how actually Thomas Sowell is part of a longer tradition of Black intellectuals and Black leaders who were equally concerned with, as you say, the questions of culture and dignity and self-respect as they were with changing the broader society and how they were received.
And the final point I would make on that is something Sowell pointed out again way back in the 1970s, is that these Black elites, these civil rights organizations and so forth, are largely out of step with the people they claim to be speaking on behalf of in many of their views. And that's something that continues to be true today. When I would go through a lot of the old interviews, television interviews and radio interviews and print interviews that Soule had done. I went through scores of them in preparation for the book. He would often be asked by an interviewer, "How does it feel to be so out of step with other blacks?" And he would inevitably correct the premise of the question, saying, you don't mean I'm out of step with other blacks. You mean I'm out of step with black elites. But black elites are no more representative of black people than white elites are of white people. And he would stress that in interviews after interviews, and then back it up with data. So you back then it was an issue like busing, school busing. The NAACP supported, civil rights leadership supported. Blacks never supported busing. They wanted good schools built right there in their neighborhood. They didn't want to put their kids on a bus and ship them out to the suburbs to integrate some white school. A majority of blacks always were opposed to doing that, but the black elites are what push for busing. And today you could go down a whole list of issues of, defunding the police, racial preferences in college admissions. Black polls show that blacks do not support those things. Black elites support those things. And then you look at the things that black elites oppose. Voter ID laws, for example, are supported by a majority of black people in this country. So there's this disconnect between these black elites. Today, these would be people like your Ibram Kendis and your Ta-Nehisi Coates and so forth. There is, and Nicole Hannah Joneses. There's a large disconnect between what they are saying on behalf of black people, what black people themselves have expressed that they want. And that is a divide that has been there a long time, and if anything, has only grown over the decades.
Another example of what you're talking about, I think, is the term Latinx, which the vast majority of average Latinos find offensive or totally unnecessary. So we got an audience question here for you, Jason. The viewer asks, what did Mr. Soule have to say about the impact of the state on the Black family? I know he has debunked the false notions that the Black family was never intact, i.e. a vestige of slavery.
Well, I think he would look at the incentives put in place by the welfare state interventions of the 1960s, namely the Great Society programs under Lyndon Johnson, which were then expanded under his successor, Richard Nixon, as having a rather devastating effect on the Black family. I think, prior to, up until the early 1960s, 2 out of 3 Black kids were being raised by a mother and a father. Today, more than 70% are not. And in some of our inner cities, it's as high as 80 or 90%. And as I mentioned earlier, throughout the I think from in every census between 1890 and 1940, the Black marriage rate in America was higher than the white marriage rate. So that breakdown of the Black family, I think Soule would say, would go a long ways toward explaining a lot of other problems in these neighborhoods. With fatherless homes, and there's a whole literature on this. With fatherless homes comes more involvement with the criminal justice system, more school dropout rates, more teen pregnancies, more drug abuse, just on down the road, and a lot of that has flowed, I think, from well-intentioned policy interventions beginning in the 1960s that have just not had the intended effect.
So first of all, reminder, stick around because we're announcing winners of our book drawing here, the book club winners. We will announce at the end of this, so stick around. I guess this, and you point out in your book that this is something that people always asked Tom Sowell to describe, like, essentially, okay, you've laid out sort of the shape of a culture, of cultural problems. You've compared cultural problems or done a comparison between not just Blacks in America, but all kinds of ethnic groups and all kinds of societies all over the world. But what is to be done about those inequalities in the United States? And I think it's fair to give the other side their due. It's fair to ask that because we have had loftier ambitions as a country, right? So what do you think, to the extent he certainly worked on a number of policies and proposed a number of policies, but what is the sort of abstract contour of the solution you think Tom Sowell is putting forward in the body of his work towards the problem of essentially a diverse but unequal society?
Well, I guess I'd take a little issue with the premise of the question, because there's an assumption there that for discrimination or racism or sexism or something, we would have equal outcomes. But Soule would say there's no evidence that equal outcomes are the norm. Uh, uh, there's no society you can point to down through history, not today, not yesterday, not 100 years ago, not 1,000 years ago, where you have these equal outcomes that are held up as normal, and where we don't find them, assume that something nefarious is going on. I often tell people that if you really want to get inside of Tom's head, in terms of where he's coming from, whether the issue is race or economics or history or sociology or what have you, the book to read is the one he's proudest of. It's called A Conflict of Visions, and it was published 1987, I believe, was the first edition. And it's a book about contrasting views of human nature, and how those contrasting views of human nature are at the root of many of our policy disputes. And he traces this back, all the way to the 18th century Britain, and writers like William Godwin, and on through Adam Smith, and then down through John Rawls, and to your social justice folks today. And what he's saying is that the two visions he describes are the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. And the constrained vision, or sometimes he calls it the tragic vision, assumes that there are limits to human betterment, that there may be problems we want to solve, war, poverty, racism, but that we're probably not going to solve entirely. We're not going to eradicate them. So what we should focus on is putting in place processes and institutions that help us best deal with problems we're probably never going to eradicate entirely. And he contrasts that with this more unconstrained or utopian view of human nature, which says, no, we can not only manage these problems, we can solve them entirely. It's just a matter of willpower and reason. And depending on where you come down on that divide, will explain how you think about all kinds of things, whether it's, use of military force, tax hikes, rent control, affirmative action, and down the list. And so Soule is coming at almost everything he's writing, he's coming at it from that more constrained view. And one of his famous sayings is that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And so you take something like minimum wage laws. You raise the minimum wage. Yes, the people who are making minimum wage are going to make more money and be better off. The downside is that some of them, however, might lose their job because their employer can no longer afford to keep them. And some people may never get hired in the first place because they become too expensive to hire under the higher minimum wage. So again, when we're analyzing policy, and when Soule is analyzing policy and so-called solutions, he's looking at it in terms of trade-offs. And so that is, that's sort of the template in which he's operating in a lot of his writings. So he doesn't quite see it as something we can solve. I've sort of adopted this view myself, as I have many of Soule's views. I mean, he's someone who's had a huge influence on my own journalism. But I wrote a book a few years ago called "Please Stop Helping Us," and the point of that book was that what Blacks in particular need is not some more government programs and solutions. I would be happy if they just stop doing things we know don't work. That's me. That's your solution. Stop forcing kids to attend school based on zip code. Give them school choice. Stop lifting the minimum wage and pricing people out of work. Stop with all the occupational licensing requirements that hamper budding entrepreneurs in some of these poor communities. I want the government to stop doing things. Soule has argued that the best thing that the civil rights movement did, its biggest victory, was its defeat of Jim Crow, getting the government off the back of Blacks in terms of legal discrimination. It is to the extent that the government has tried to help Blacks, we've gotten in trouble through things like affirmative action and so forth. Or welfare state expansions and that sort of thing that have been largely counterproductive. So to me, to the extent that he's offering solutions, it's to stop doing what we know doesn't work. It would be a good place to start.
Jason, I've got your book, Please Stop Helping Us, on my bookshelf behind me. And I'm excited to add this one on my bookshelf now too. It was an amazing read. And I think Thomas Sowell was gypped. I think he deserves a Nobel Prize for economics. But I think in some ways he got distracted by, the horrible intellectual dragging down of discourse. And he deserves it as far as I'm concerned. But I'm so glad that you wrote the book. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know Inez is going to announce the names, but in the meantime, Jason will let you go. And we very much appreciate it. And we encourage all of our viewers here to make sure to check out this book, Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. You will not be disappointed. And also, Jason made a documentary on the same topic, which is an incredible documentary, it's a great companion to the book, which I also recommend. Jason, thank you so much.
Thank you both. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jason. And thanks to all of the listeners who are out there. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your comments in the chat section. And I have the privilege of announcing our book club winners. So Derek Ayuto, which means I'm going to butcher everyone's name, having a name that is frequently butchered. I understand the pain, but nevertheless must press forward. So Derek Ayuto, you are a winner. Hurate Golbinus or Golbinus. I'm sorry, I'm butchering your names. Again, apologies. And then Nancy Wata, you guys are our book club winners. So I believe somebody from our team will contact you, reach out to you and let you know how you receive your book. So congratulations.
Yes, congratulations, all the winners. Thank you for watching. We're so grateful that you've been here. And, we're so glad for our audience here, and we hope that you enjoyed this book and our discussion. And if you have any feedback, please send us a note in our Facebook group, or you can email us. The email address is info@iwf.org. We would certainly love to hear from you. And just from taking a look at our guest list, we have a lot of new names who are joining us. So I want to take 15 seconds just to introduce you all to the Independent Women's Forum, also known as IWF. So IWF is the leading national women's organization dedicated to developing and advancing policies that enhance people's freedoms, choices, and well-being. We do things like testifying before Congress and state legislatures. We produce educational materials and publish articles about various policy issues. We file legal briefs in various court cases, and we frequently interface with the media to make the better case for better public policy. We also make a point to champion women from across the country. We celebrate women and their accomplishments in their lives. If you haven't read our champion women profiles, I hope you will go to our website on iwf.org under the About tab. We release a new profile every 2 weeks of a woman that should be on your radar, and you'll be excited and inspired by these profiles of these women under Champion Women. And we would love, of course, to have you more involved with IWF. So we encourage you to go to our website and sign up to receive our latest news, updates, and events. My colleague just sent the sign up, actually, the pop-up there. We'd love to have you subscribe to our email network. We've also got a new group, which it's been such an exciting platform to be part of. It's called the Independent Women's Network. It's a secure platform where we have honest conversations about everything from politics and culture to family and education. We have, just for you all here, a 50% discount off coupon for people who are here today. I will give you that code. It is Book Club 50, and I think they'll put that in the chat for you also. So that does it for us. Time for us to say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. We wish you happy holidays from all of us here at Independent Women's Forum. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to everybody. And thank you again for joining us to discuss Maverick, which I hope if you haven't read yet, you will. Our polls show that there's still a few people who have not quite managed to read this yet, but really highly recommend it. It's really a fascinating intellectual history into the work of, I think, one of the greatest scholars of the 20th century and into the 21st. So highly recommend that. Thanks again for tuning in to IWF Book Club, and we'll see you next time.